Welcome back, everyone. We are now going to turn our focus from designing public DNS resolution on Azure to now focusing on private DNS, which by comparison has quite a bit more configuration options we need to be aware of. This initial lesson is going to be a high-level overview of the variety of private DNS implementation methods on Azure, which we are going to unpack in more detail over the next few lessons. In this initial lesson, we will, as usual, start with a big picture view of how private DNS works in general, and then we're going to take a little bit of a deep dive into the options of implementing private DNS on Azure, which actually have three different methods available, which include Azure Provided Name Resolution, Azure Private DNS Zones, and a customer-provided DNS server option. So jumping on into it, once again starting with the big picture, how exactly does private DNS work? Well, going back to our earlier phone book analogy, you can think of private DNS resolution as DNS resolution in a private network. In other words, not public. One main change from private DNS to public DNS is that compared to public DNS, private DNS resolution is not managed by a public registrar like GoDaddy, Google Domains, and others. A classic example of private DNS in action is connecting to an Office printer when working in an office environment. Once again, our Office network is not a public network, but a private one. In our example in which we want to print to our printer, our laptop or our Office computer will reach out to a private DNS server, which will provide the internal printer host name to IP address mapping. In this case, if we wanted to print to printer 1, the DNS server would reply back that our printer 1 DNS private hostname would correlate with the IP address of 10.1.1.4, which is again a private IP address. So with this in mind, how exactly does Azure handle implementing private DNS? Well, the answer is one of my all-time favorite answers. Yes, that's right, it depends. In fact, we actually have three different private DNS methods on Azure depending on what exactly you need to do. Those methods are the Azure Provided Name Resolution, which is the default private DNS option. One custom option is implementing an Azure Private DNS Zone, which is very similar to public DNS zones, except, yes, it's private. And the third option is supplying a customer-supplied DNS server, which is a customer-managed virtual machine that exists inside your virtual network to handle private DNS duties. And as mentioned before, the reason we have three different options is that each use case is necessary for different options and scenarios, and we're going to take some time to unpack those scenarios over the next few lessons. For now, though, let's take a real quick look, including the pros and cons of each of our three different private DNS options. The first one we're going to focus on is Azure Provided Name Resolution. As I mentioned before, this is the default option. Whenever you create a virtual machine, if you do not have a private DNS zone registered, DNS resolution is automatically added for you with no additional input necessary from you. Additionally, the default option of Azure Provided Name Resolution is also global in scope, as is the private DNS zone option as well, which means that Azure's managed DNS resolution services are not bound to a single region, but rather relevant all around the world. Now, what's really interesting about Azure Provided Name Resolutions is that behind the scenes there's actually quite a bit going on. We're not going to get too deeply into it. However, there are a couple terms, and especially a specific IP address that you do need to be aware of. When working with Azure Provided Name Resolution and a lot of networking functions in general, there is a global IP address that is often referred to as the wire server that handles a lot of DNS resolution and other network communications. This globally available IP address that correlates with the wire server is 168.63.129.16. You may want to memorize that IP address, or at least be aware that that IP address handles the default DNS resolution on Azure, as well as, again, a number of other behind-the-scenes networking functions. In our specific example of default name resolution, whenever we create a virtual machine, that virtual machine will automatically register its DNS name with that 168.63.129.16 globally available IP address, and that IP address handles default name resolution for all resources on Azure that are not using the private DNS or other custom options. Moving on, let's go ahead and break down the main pros and cons of using the default option of using Azure Provided Name Resolution. The biggest pro or advantage of using this method is that it's automatic. There's absolutely nothing that you need to do to configure it. You create a virtual machine, and just like magic, you have DNS resolution. Very nice. You can also combine it with some scenarios in which you need to use on-premises DNS forwarding, which is often used in combination with the customer-supplied DNS option we're going to talk more about later. When it comes to cons or downsides, well, once again, it's automatic, which also means we have very little customization or flexibility. We are not able to provide a custom DNS suffix, which means that all automatically registered DNS entries will end with .internal.cloudapp.net. And the biggest con to be aware of is that DNS resolution using this method is scoped to the individual virtual network only, which means you are not able to provide private DNS resolution across multiple connected virtual networks. Only resources inside of that Azure Virtual Network will be able to use private DNS resolution using only this method. And the last con to be aware of, we'll talk more about here in just a little bit, is that you also do not have the ability to manually register new DNS records as well, compared to the private DNS zone option, which does let you do that. Speaking of which, let's take a quick look at the Azure Private DNS Zone, which is our second Azure native solution. Azure Private DNS Zones provide custom private DNS resolution within Azure, in which, just like public DNS zones, we create a private DNS zone service, which we can register to a domain name such as controlaltsuites.com. In this case, controlaltsuites.com will be our private domain name in addition to our public one. Azure Private DNS Zones have a few key features. First of all, it is a managed service. Like many other managed services, you don't have to configure and set up your own DNS server that you're responsible for managing. Also, like the Azure provided name resolution method, it is also global in scope, so the zone is globally available and not bound to a single region. It provides the default option of automatic registration on delegated virtual networks. In other words, a delegated network will automatically register with that private DNS host. However, you also have a lot more flexibility compared to the default Azure provided DNS resolution, which we'll talk about here right now. Moving on to the pros and cons of working with Azure Private DNS Zones. Compared to the default Azure provided method, you can use custom DNS suffixes. You can also create manual DNS records in addition to automatically registered ones. And very important to note, compared to the default option, you can resolve private DNS queries across connected Azure virtual networks. And just to expand out further, if you have multiple networks with multiple private DNS zones, you can resolve DNS queries across multiple connected or associated Azure private DNS zones. Now, with that in mind, it's not the perfect solution in more scenarios. For starters, there is more to configure versus an Azure provided resolution. Of course, the default option has no configuration necessary, so anything is going to be a little bit more work for you. And the most important con or downside to be aware of is that this provides Azure resolution only, which means if we have to resolve private DNS queries to and from non-Azure sources, such as a connected on-premises network, Azure Private DNS Zones is not able to handle those type of queries. Moving on, let's quickly look at our third option, which is able to handle those type of queries, which is our customer-provided DNS server option. Overall, a customer-provided DNS server is a self-managed virtual machine that exists inside of a virtual network that handles private DNS resolution. This virtual machine in your virtual network will act as that DNS server for all your private DNS queries. This much more involved and manual option has two main purposes that you need to be aware of. The first one we're not going to talk about too much is that it handles DNS resolutions from app servers to your virtual network. And the second one that we're going to talk about in a lot more detail in the next lesson is hybrid scenarios in which you need to forward or resolve DNS queries from your on-premises network to Azure resources and vice versa. There's quite a bit to unpack with that specific scenario, and we're going to talk more about that in the next lesson. For the time being, that's going to wrap up our initial overview of working with private DNS on Azure. Let's go ahead and review our key takeaways before we continue this discussion in the next lesson. In this lesson, we started with the big picture overview of how private DNS works, in which it provides DNS resolution in private as opposed to public networks. We then covered the main private DNS options in regards to Azure, in which we talked about the Azure provided DNS resolution, Azure private DNS zones, and customer-provided DNS servers. We then took a quick look at each of those three options in more details, including the pros and cons. Starting with Azure-provided DNS resolution, we learned that it's automatic, no configuration necessary. However, it is scoped to a single virtual network's worth of resolution only. And it also has this downside of rigid or specific suffix names, and you don't have much customization with that. We also took a quick look at Azure Private DNS Zones, which do provide more customization and flexibility, which include cross virtual network resolution. However, it is scoped to our Azure resources only. And the third option we're going to talk about in a bit more detail coming up is customer provided DNS, which is used for app service integration and more notably hybrid scenarios, which we're going to talk about in our next lesson, among other topics as well. That's going to go ahead and wrap up this lesson. Let's go ahead and move on to the next one.